Hi everyone. I am going to do a quick video about your 5E lesson plan, which is your next big assignment that's coming up in the course. So this is about your 5E lesson plan, and just so everybody knows, I did move back that due date till April 6th, so you have a good almost 10 days before it's due. All right, so your 5E lesson plan is going to be still done within that curriculum group, but you're doing individual lesson plans. So you're going to use the standards and topics that are already in your curriculum planning group that you already did a text set about. And then you can use your inquiry question, your big inquiry question that you created in that text set, or you can revise it a little bit based on the feedback I gave you. And then for your individual lessons, you're going to split up that big inquiry question so each individual person can have one supporting question to focus their inquiry lesson plan on. And they don't have to align perfectly, like you don't have to say, okay, this person's going to go first and then we're going to build on that and do that lesson. Basically, the only thing you need to worry about is that you all are supporting that inquiry lesson and you all have individual supporting questions to focus your lesson plan on that are a little bit different but still supporting that big inquiry question. So for example, one of my in-class groups is their big inquiry question for their whole group is how were children involved in the Holocaust? And then one person is going to do a lesson on how were children involved in resisting the Nazis. Another person is going to do a lesson on how were children victims of the Holocaust. And another person is going to do a lesson on how were what were the experiences of children survivors of the Holocaust. So they're all, each lesson has an individual question, but they all support that big inquiry question. Okay, just like how we would want you to design an inquiry unit for social studies. And your 5E lesson plan is going to follow a 5E format, and so this is what that format looks like. So it's different than a 6-step lesson plan. A 6-step lesson plan assumes that the teacher has the content and the skills, and they are imparting it to the students. And so that's why I do it first and model, then we do it together and I help you, and then you do it on your own. So it's starting with me, giving it to you. In a 5E lesson plan, it's assumed that students have prior knowledge that impacts how they're going to construct new knowledge. And it also assumes that students will all construct knowledge a little bit differently. And so the teacher's job in a 5E lesson plan is to create an opportunity, to facilitate an opportunity for students to construct knowledge. Okay, so it's not like I'm spoon feeding them the skill, or you directly inputting and banking that information into their head. I'm providing them an opportunity to construct knowledge on a question. So the first E is engage. In that section, you're going to engage prior knowledge and you're going to get them excited and interested in the inquiry question for your lesson plan. The second E is explore. You're going to provide opportunities for students to construct new knowledge to answer that inquiry question. So in social studies, it might look like they're analyzing maps or they're analyzing historical sources like you've been reading about with historical thinking, or they're doing a simulation. It could be a lot of different things, but it shouldn't be just like answering closed questions, like, finding all the right answers in something. It should be that they're analyzing something and they're going a little bit deeper to interpret something, to construct their own knowledge. And then after they've done that, you want them to explain the new knowledge that they've constructed. And so there needs to be an opportunity for them to explain that new knowledge. And some students might have constructed misconceptions or still might not be clear about the answer to this question. So it's the teacher's job to facilitate that explanation and to support accurate constructions of knowledge and to correct misconceptions. And then evaluate, we want to evaluate what new knowledge they've constructed in relation to that inquiry question. So just like we were assessing in the 6-step lesson plan, you're going to assess the new knowledge they've constructed here. So again, that should be an open-ended question, an open-ended opportunity for them to do that. Maybe it's a quick write or a graphic organizer, but it should be directly related to that inquiry question. And then elaborate. In social studies, we flip the two. Sometimes in science, I know you do the elaborate first, but we flipped them for a few different reasons. But for the elaborate, you're going to have them apply their new understandings in a new way by connecting it to another topic. So, I always like to say if you're studying something in history, during the elaborate, you could say, well, how does this impact us today? Or how is this alike or different than the way things are today? So kind of connecting it to a new topic is always a good idea. So I'm going to run through a really quick example that I do in my in-class lesson plan. And so I first want to engage students in kind of thinking about their prior knowledge and really kind of get them interested in the topic that we're learning about. So I might do a see, think, wonder on this image and have students say, what do you see there? What do you think? What does it make you wonder? And we kind of discuss that. Well, they might say, oh, I see Martin Luther King. It looks like, I don't know, it looks like there's some things down here that's a sign that someone is holding up, or maybe it's a billboard. And sometimes they'll say, well, who is that person over there? It kind of looks like Rosa Parks over there. It makes me wonder if that's her, and if her and Martin Luther King were, you know, at this place, and why people were saying it was a communist training school. And then we do another one, but then I say, what makes you say that? So I say, what's going on in this photo? And they might say, well, it seems like they're learning together. And then the routine is, what makes you say that? So having reasons for what they're saying. So both of these are actually historical thinking routines, the see, think, wonder, and the what makes you see that. And you can use them in lots of different ways in social studies for history, but I like to use them in Engage to get students really interested in the topic that we're going to learn about. So I'm going to let you know that both those photos do have something to do with Rosa Parks, and today we're going to focus on learning a little bit more about her. And I might say, how many of you know a lot about Rosa Parks already? And most people raise their hand. Say, okay, I want you to do a quick story map and tell me what you already know about the story of Rosa Parks. And I give them a few minutes to do that story map, and then we discuss what's on there and, kind of jog their memory. What year did that happen? And what state was it in? And then I'll say, and many of them will say, well, she stayed seated because her feet hurt that day and she was really tired. And so I'll say, wow, from what I've read of the civil rights movement, it was a pretty vicious time in terms of the resistance that civil rights leaders were facing. And so, she really risked her job. She risked her safety. She risked her husband's job. And doing that, does that seem like something she would do because her feet hurt? And students will say, no, that doesn't seem right. And so I say, okay, let's try to figure out what else was going on during that time period that might have given her reason more than just her feet hurt to stay seated that day. So I said, we're going to really focus on these two questions today. How might the context have affected her decision? And the her is Rosa Parks. So the context is what's going on around a situation. So in the time and place of that person, what else was happening or surrounding? And then the second question we're going to talk about a little bit today is, what is the master and critical narrative of this history? So why don't we learn certain parts about the civil rights movement, especially about the Rosa Parks story? So all of that was engaging. I engaged their prior knowledge on the topic. I got them excited and interested and trying to think through, well, how did the context of Rosa Parks really affect her decision? Then the second part, the second E, is explore. And so then my students are broken up into groups, and they are each exploring primary documents, just like you guys have read about in your historical thinking reading. So one person is reading a letter from the first African-American staff member in the White House. Another person is reading a letter that someone wrote about the Highlander Folk School. Another person is reading the police report of Claudette Colvin, who actually stayed seated in Montgomery 9 months before Rosa Parks did. Another group is reading about the Montgomery bus boycott and how people walk to work, sometimes 7 miles each way for over a year. They boycotted buses, and what finally got the buses to be integrated. And so all these groups are using a primary source, and they're also using an analysis sheet to help them really analyze that primary document, help them think through, well, what does this have to do with Rosa Parks? How might what's going on in this contextual factor have impacted her decision to stay seated? And so they're spending time really constructing knowledge about that. And then after they've been able to do that for a while, then I have them explain their new understanding. So a jigsaw is where in that group they become experts, and then I number them off again. And then they go to new groups where there's one expert from each original group. And then they have to share in their new groups what they learned about, what primary source they analyzed to help us answer this question about the context of Rosa Parks. And then as a whole class, we talked through each of the documents and what they told us and what they had to do maybe with Rosa Parks. Or, you know, one document goes over the murder of Emmett Till, and if you don't know that history, I strongly suggest learning about that. But Rosa Parks said that when she stayed seated on that bus that day, she was thinking about Emmett Till, and he was a 13-year-old boy who was brutally murdered in Mississippi about 4 or 5 months before Rosa Parks stayed seated on the bus. And so, and another letter that they've analyzed talks about how that particular incident was really bringing national attention to the inequalities and the injustice that was happening in the South with segregation. So all these things were impacting Rosa's decision to stay seated, but we don't often hear about those other things. We only hear about her on that bus that one day, and then all the buses became integrated, right? After a boycott. We don't often hear about how difficult that boycott was and how many people collectively had to organize. Another thing that they read about was that Rosa Parks went to a school called the Highlander Folk School, and she learned how to be an activist, and she learned how to stand up for her rights and different strategies for being an activist at the Highlander Folk School up in the Tennessee mountains. And so we don't often learn about that history. We don't learn that she was this really strong activist. She was a secretary for NAACP. She was investigating a lot of injustices that were happening in the court system against African Americans prior to her staying seated on that bus. So I'm helping those small group discussions and that big group discussion. I'm helping students try to make those explanations of how these contextual factors affected Rosa Parks. And then I do let them know that this was a photograph of this type of things that were happening at the Highlander Folk School. So we might notice that there's a lot of white individuals who are learning these strategies as well to be activists, and they were listening to a Black man, which didn't happen a lot of times during this time period, right? So you can see that they're really respecting him as they look up in that photograph. This also was a real photograph from the time, and that is Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And the Highlander Folk School was criticized for being a communist training school because some of the rights that people were learning how to fight for were labor rights. And so it was dubbed a communist training school. And Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were both involved in that school beforehand. And so for the evaluate, I have them on a note card think about the Rosa Parks stories that they've learned about in the past, and say, if you had to add 2 more things to that story, what would you add to Rosa Parks' story that you think people really need to know about the context to understand that history better? And so that's how I'm evaluating their answer to that inquiry question for the lesson. All right, and then the next E is elaborate. And so the last E is to elaborate. And so then I asked them, okay, so we kind of have learned this master narrative about Rosa Parks. And it was a very simple story, and it didn't involve all the other things about violence against African-American activists. Another thing they learned about was the Harry T. Moore murder on Christmas of a white supremacist bombing his house. And so we often don't learn about that violence, how violent the time was against activists. We don't learn about how many people had to collectively organize. There's a lot that we don't learn about in that history. And so we learn kind of this simplified master narrative instead of a counter narrative about how complicated and how much collective organization was required to resist white power in that time period. So then I asked them, what do you think else has been downplayed in the history that you've learned about? Where else do you feel like you might have gotten a master narrative and there might be more to the story than you've learned about in history? So that's my way of having them elaborate a little bit. And then I do that. This is the evaluate that I was talking about before, but we have you guys do the evaluate before the elaborate in your lesson plan. So again, I have to have a assessment that allows them to show that they have constructed some new understandings to that inquiry question. I'm running out of time here in my 15-minute timer. So I want you to think about this lesson plan as something a lot different than a 6-step lesson plan. Whereas a 6-step lesson plan, I might use an anchor chart at the beginning and say, these are the things you need to know. a 5E lesson plan, I might have students explore and we might build an anchor chart together at the end. So it's the students constructing the knowledge. All right, I think that's all I have for you. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me and I will be sure to get back to you right away about these lessons.